Before we begin looking at a brief history of food law, share a few more pictures with you. This was Olivia when she was quite small, actually, and again, we were fishing on Beals Pond, and this is, I think, actually the first crappie that she ever caught. And this was again a fish that we released after she caught it, but she was certainly having a good time fishing that day. And this is a picture that was taken actually last winter, again on Fields Pond, one of certainly our favorite places to fish. And that's my son and I and my grandson Isaac and a crappie that he caught that again was released after this picture happened to be taken. And this is a picture that was taken last winter. I feed the deer behind my house in Vesey, and as you can see, last winter was a pretty hard winter, so I usually had 8 to 10 deer come every night, and they were fed grain and whole corn. And once spring came and the grass was green, they disappeared. This is, I think that was the third year I fed them. Just as a side, this year, the winter being so mild, they didn't start coming to eat until about probably about a week ago. And certainly there aren't as many, and they're not eating as much because it hasn't been as cold and as snowy a winter. Let's look at the history of food law. Kind of interesting, actually. But as we look at early food laws, actually, if we go down to and look at the Bible, they were laws that were passed down from Moses, and certainly they're the basis for kosher foods that we will talk about religious food laws at the very end of the semester. One of the questions you're asked this week is, what is the Islamic equivalent of kosher? And I think you'll find if you look at this, there are, and as we look at it at the end of the semester, there are certainly many similarities between these two religions in terms of their food laws. Theophrastus in 370 to 285 BC, he had wrote something called the Inquiry into Plants, and he discussed the use of artificial preservatives and flavors added to foods for economic reasons. So you might think that certainly using artificial preservatives and flavors is relatively new, but if you go back in a time before Christ even, you will see information that is written looking at this whole issue. Caveat emptor, again, the question that's asked for your assignment this week is, what does it mean? Certainly selling adulterated food in Rome in 4000 AD, the actual penalty for doing this was banishment from Rome or even slavery. The beginnings of civilization, they were certainly concerned with as quality and food safety. In 2002, King John proclaimed the first English food law, and it's the size of bread, and you know what it prohibited. What it actually did, this particular slide shows you, the statute fixed the size, weight, and prices of loaves in relation to the price of wheat, and it really set a standard of identity, and this was actually in effect for 6 centuries, so 600 years. In 1820, there was a treatise on adulteration of food and culinary poisons and methods for actually detecting them, and this was written by a German-born English chemist, Frederick Accum. And actually, he had to flee England when he demonstrated that the pepper was almost invariably adulterated with mustard husk and pea flour and other additives. One has to think and remember that something like pepper as a spice was very worth a lot of money, and if you could actually dilute the actual amount of pepper with something like mustard husk, which costs nothing, or pea flour, which is very cheap, then you could make a lot of money. And certainly this is one of the first examples, certainly, of adulteration and recorded adulteration. So some of the questions that certainly are asked of you is, what is the definition of adulterated? How does it differ from misbranding? And then one of the things you're asked to do is find the definitions and where it's referred to in federal regulations. So early food laws certainly addressed adulterated and misbranding, and certainly these are things that we're still very much concerned for, and it was defined by the Act, but courts left interpretation to specific cases. And vinegar made from selected fresh apples when actually made from dried apples. Is this a case of misbranding, or is this a case of adulteration? It's something for you to think about. In 1860, the British Parliament passes the first British adulteration food laws, and this occurred when 3 people died when copper of arsenite was used to color food served at a banquet. So again, using something with arsenic in it to maintain food color was something that actually led to deaths, and this led to some of the earlier legislation related to adulteration of foods. In 1862, Lincoln actually appoints the chemist Charles Weatherall to serve in the new Department of Agriculture, and this was the beginning of the formation of the Bureau of Chemistry, and this was actually the predecessor of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. In 1880, Peter Collier was the chief chemist. USDA for the USDA recommended passage of a national food and drug law, and it was based on their investigation that they were doing into the adulteration of food. And the bill was defeated, and we might ask ourselves, why was this particular bill defeated? The next 25 years took for another 100 food and drug laws were introduced into Congress, and none of those laws actually passed. And again, ask yourself, why was that the case? In 1883, Dr. Harvey W. Wiley, who became the chief chemist in the expansion of the Bureau of Chemistry's food adulteration studies. He was actually the state chemist for the state of Indiana, which was housed at Purdue University. And Dr. Wiley campaigned for the first federal food law, and was referred to as the crusading chemist and the father of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. He created the Poison Squad, and one can see in this little picture down at the bottom of the slide a picture of what was referred to as a poison squad. And one of the questions for you for this week is, what is it and why was it important? In 1897, the Tea Importation Act passed, inspection by custom of all tea entering U.S. ports at the expense of the importers. And in 1898, the AAOC establishes a committee on food standards, and this was headed by Dr. Wiley, and states began to incorporate these standards into state statutes at that time. In 1902, Congress appropriates $5,000, and at that time that was a lot of money, to study chemical preservatives and colors and their effect on digestion and health. And again, these studies were directed by Dr. Wiley, and it drew certainly widespread attention to food adulteration. And public support for passage of the federal food and drug law grew as a result of the work that was done looking at studying chemical preservatives and colors. So in 1906, we had passage of the Pure Food and Drug Acts, and it prohibited the interstate commerce in misbranded and adulterated foods, drink, and drugs. And also in 1906, we had passage of the Meat Inspection Act, and it was passed the same day as the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And a question for you to think about is, what author played a significant role in this act? And we'll be talking more about this author later on in the semester. And the act resulted from what was going on certainly in the meat and poultry industry at that time in terms of insanitary conditions, the use of poisonous preservatives and dyes in foods, and certainly the poor working conditions for those individuals who are working in meat processing and meat slaughter facilities. In many instances, children were working actually in these facilities. In 1938, we had the Gould Amendment, and this dealt with food package contents and stated they shall be plainly and conspicuously marked on the outside of the package, including weight, measure, and numerical count. In 1914, the U.S. versus Lexington Mill and Elevator Company, this was certainly an act that occurred as a result of a court ruling. It was the first ruling on food additives. Bleached flour with nitrite residues required government to actually show harm. The interesting thing about this is they were using nitrite certainly as a residue in bleached flours because it was used as a bleaching agent. And in this case, under the 1906 Act, it was up to the federal government to show that that particular substance was harmful before it could be banned for use in this particular instance. So the onus was never at this point in time on the actual user of the chemical or the producer of the chemical. It was actually on the federal government. In 1930, the McNary-Mapes Amendment authorized the FDA standards of quality fill of container for canned foods, excluding milk and milk products. In 1930 was when the actual FDA was established as a name. So Food and Drug Administration was established as a name in 1930. 1938, probably one of the most important, certainly, food laws was passed, and it was the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. And it had a number of new provisions from the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. It had provided for safe tolerances to be set for unavoidable poisonous substances that might be found in foods. It authorized standards of identity, standards of quality and fill of container for foods, and some examples that you might think of. And we'll certainly be talking about standards of identity later in the semester. It authorized factory inspections. Before this, factory inspections were not authorized under federal law, and added remedy of court injunctions to previous penalties of seizure and prosecution. And when we talk about enforcement, we look at FDA enforcement later on in the semester, we'll talk about the four major ways or procedures that are available to the FDA for ensuring compliance. 1938, we also had the Wheeler-Lee Act. The Federal Trade Commission was charged with overseeing advertising that was associated with products otherwise regulated by the FDA. And the exceptions in this case were prescription drugs, which were still controlled by the FDA. In 1939, we had the first food standards, canned tomatoes, tomato puree, and tomato paste. And one of the questions for this week's assignment is to go to the FDA website and find the part and section in the regulations where the standards of identity are listed for these particular products. In 1947, we had the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It prohibited pesticide use until the EPA determined there were unreasonable adverse effects on humans or on the environment. Another very, very certainly important act, and we'll talk about another individual who played a role certainly as it relates to a book that she wrote, a woman that has some ties to Maine, related to pesticides and the issues certainly with one particular pesticide use in the environment. In 1938, we had the Miller Amendment, and it affirmed that the FDA applies to goods regulated by the agency that have been transported interstate and have reached the consumer. So this allowed them to regulate all the way down to the consumer. And all of these amendments were to the 1938 Act. In 1949, the FDA published a guidance to industry. It was called the Black Book, and it was listed procedures for appraisal of the toxicity of chemicals in foods. In 1950, we had the Oleomargarine Act, and one of your questions is what is its purpose and why was it implemented? In 1950, we had the Delaney Committee, and they started work that was the foundation for the 1954 Miller Pesticide Amendment, the 1938 Food Additives Amendment, and the 1960 Color Additives Amendment. In 1954, we had the passage of the Miller Pesticide Amendment, and it established procedures for setting safety limits for pesticide residues on raw agricultural commodities. Still, certainly a very, very important issue. Certainly, as we've looked at the prominence of organic foods and the use, certainly, of pesticides on food products, consumers certainly have some concerns. In 1958, we had the Food Additive Amendment. It requires manufacturers of new food additives to establish safety and included the Delaney Proviso. The Delaney Proviso is also associated with the Color Additives Amendment, and the question that you're asked is what is the Delaney Proviso or the Delaney Clause? In 1958, the FDA actually published the first list of GRAS substances in the Federal Register, and it contained about 200 substances. GRAS substances can still be added and removed, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act of 1938. In 1960, we had passage of the Color Amendment, and it required manufacturers to establish the safety of color additives in foods, drugs, and cosmetics, and it also included the Delaney Proviso or Delaney Clause. Certainly, there has been some concern with some of the particularly artificial colors that have been used, as well as some of the natural colors that were actually extracted from particular substances in the environment. In 1966, we had the Fair Packaging Labeling Act, that all consumer products in interstate commerce shall be honestly and informatively labeled. And 1967, the good manufacturing practices were established, and we'll be saying more certainly later in the semester about good manufacturing practices as they apply to foods, but we'll also talk about them as when we talk about dietary supplements as well. The relatively new issue of good manufacturing practice for that particular segment of the industry. In 1970, the EPA established given the responsibility for setting pesticide tolerances, and we'll talk a little bit more about setting pesticide tolerances later. In 1973, we had low-acid canned food processing regulations issued, and my question that's asked of you in the assignment is, why did we have these regulations put into place? In 1977, we had something to do with saccharin, and saccharin was used as certainly an artificial sweetener, and a question might be asked is, what is saccharin, and what was saccharin's major uses? In 1980, we had the Infant Formula Act, which established special FDA controls to ensure necessary nutritional content and safety as it applied to infant formulas. And we might ask ourselves, why was this important? And certainly there has been, in the fairly near past, some issues related to infant formulas. In 1990, we had the Nutritional Labeling and Education Act. Certainly, what are the important provisions of this? But I think many of you certainly know this, and this certainly will be discussed in much more detail later. As I said in the intro to the syllabus, that a lot certainly is going on even today as it relates to nutritional labels on food products. In 1990, we had the proposed Organic Products Act. It's a National Organic Standards Board made recommendations to the USDA in 1994, and passage was held up by inclusion of the original bill with new technologies. The genetic engineering of foods and food irradiation could be used for organic products in the initial bill, and certainly this was of major concern to, particularly in Maine, MOFGA. Somewhat instrumental certainly in working to get those deleted from the bill. And then safety issues related to the use of sewer sludge as a fertilizer. If labeled organic, it must be inspected and certified by a USDA or a private entity. Just for your information, MOFGA actually has an entity as part of MOFGA that can actually do the certification, and they do much of the certification certainly for Maine products. It requires inspection and periodic residue testing of food, and required production methods maintain soil fertility, no synthetic pesticide or fertilizers, greater than 3 years prior to certification. We might ask ourselves, how did that compare to Maine's MOFGA certification in terms certainly of the number of years? MOFGA's regulations, as they were proposed for and were used in Maine, were more stringent than the final federal law. Then finally, in October of 2002, we had final passage of the USDA National Organic Program Guidelines, using 100% organic, made with organic ingredients, less than 70% organic ingredients, and what is on the package for each, I would ask you to think about. Do all products, a question that's asked, do all products in categories 1 and 2, 100% organic or organic, have the seal? In other words, do you have to put that seal on your product if it's 100% organic or organic? And how do you prevent the use of the seal for non-organic products? Well, as the bill was written and the law was put into place, there were fines up to $10,000 per offense. Something to think about, though, is as one thinks about this and the selling of organic products that really aren't organic. Organic products certainly actually get a certainly premium in the marketplace in terms of cost, and if a company's not caught, they can certainly make a lot of money selling a non-organic for organic. In 1994, the Delaney Supplemental Health and Education Act, and we'll be discussing this later as it applies to dietary supplements. And in 1996, the Organic Quality Protection Act, it eliminated the Delaney Proviso, or the Delaney Clause for pesticides, and established a risk-benefit concept and issue of total life exposure. We'll be talking more about that later on. The Delaney Clause and Delaney Proviso was eliminated from pesticides, but not from color additives at this point, and not from food additives yet. Federal laws, we have HACCP regulations. As you can see up there, there's a picture of seafood, and you can see a fruit or vegetable use. This happens to be a fruit juice. Seafood HACCPs HACCP was introduced in '96. For fruit and vegetable juice processing was in 2001. We also have additional regulations under the USDA control. We have the Federal Poultry Products Inspection Act of 1957 and the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967. We'll say a little bit more about those later on in the semester. We had the Wholesome Poultry Products Act of '68, and then HACCP and Pathogen Reduction Act associated with meat and poultry products that came about in 2000. And some examples, certainly, of products that would be under inspection as examples of some half of hog carcasses that would come under inspection. They could be inspected for quality. They can also be inspected for yield. Federal laws, we also have the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, and it requires the registration of all food processors in the U.S. as well as those exporting to the U.S. Home-based processors were exempt under this, and this can actually be done online at this particular website. Labeling by January 1st of 2006, the amount of trans fat in each food, right under the amount of saturated fat, and we might ask the question, why was it important to label for trans fats? And certainly you'll see a lot of food labels now that say no trans fats or zero trans fats. We'll address that particular point when we talk about food labeling as well. As we looked at the Food Safety Modernization Act, it deals in addition to with some other issues related to registration as well that we'll talk about. We had the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act that was implemented in 2006, and this will be discussed later in the semester, and we'll look at how this is controlled actually using food labeling as well. In 2013 we had the Food Code. This is the latest science-based information on food safety for retail and food service industries. So this is not looking necessarily at processors, but looking at the retail segment of the industry as well as the food service segment. And it's used by over 3,000 regulatory agencies. It was released in November of 2013, and it updated the 2009 Food Code. We should be actually seeing a new Food Code that will update the 2013 Food Code very, very shortly. In 2007, we look at cloned animals. Food from cloned animals. It was an 800-page document report from the FDA. There was no difference between cloned and conventionally produced food. More recently, they've come out related to certainly salmon. And if you look at something that's come down within the last 6 months, relative to there is no, FDA reports there's no issue with consuming salmon that was produced through cloning. Commodity-specific guidance, CSGs, are intended for growers, packers, processors, transporters, retailers, others certainly in the supply chain. They were developed for tomatoes, leafy greens, and melons, and the comment period here was extended until January of 2010. One of the real issues here has been the number of foodborne illness outbreaks that have been associated with these particular products. Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli 15787, as well as other pathogenic E. coli. And certainly we're seeing this continue, actually, this trend. And certainly fresh sprouts to be eaten raw have been another major concern from food safety aspect. Food safety legislation, Senate Bill 510, FDA Food Safety Modernization Act. It was passed in the Senate by a voice vote in actually 2009, and it would establish a Food Safety Administration within the Department of Health and Human Service. It would be established to protect human public health, preventing foodborne illness, to ensure food safety, to improve food safety research, and improving security of food from international contamination. In November of 2010, the Senate modified the bill in response to comments from industry and small farmers. It would exempt those selling directly to the consumer, such as farm stands and farmers markets. There would be $5,000 a year fee was removed from the original bill because very small process. That's a lot of money for them to pay per year to actually implement this legislation. In December 8th of 2010, it passed the House as part of a year-end budget bill. It doesn't include meat, poultry, and processed eggs because they are currently under USDA and a much more rigorous inspection and oversight. Food Safety Modernization Act was signed by President Obama on January 4th of 2011. The key provisions: improving the capacity to prevent food safety problems, improving the capacity to detect and respond to food safety problems, and improving the safety of imported foods. It's still in the process of being implemented and will have a major, certainly, impact on Maine farm-based processors. The final rules, November 2015, dealt with produce safety, foreign supplier verification programs, and importers of food for human and animals, accreditation by third-party certification, and environmental impact of the proposed legislation. Certainly, Food Safety Modernization Act will be updated later in the semester under enforcement as we begin to look at more and more things that are occurring under this legislation. A website that one certainly can go to find information relative to any of the history of food law is provided for you. And this one other slide, I will ask some trivia questions about on some of these certainly videos. They're nothing that counts for credit, but just some things for you to think about. In Japan, what is the most popular topping for pizza at Domino's Pizza? I think you'll find it kind of interesting to find out what it is. I don't think it's anything that we would find being very popular in the U.S.